Okay, so worldly winds. So the worldly winds is a teaching of the Buddha, and it consists of 8 qualities or 8 conditions that blow about in life, and they're arranged in 4 pairs of opposites. So there's gain and there's loss, there's praise and there's blame, there's fame and there's infamy, and there's pleasure and there's pain. And well, in the Buddhist tradition they're called the loka dhammas, which literally means the conditions of the world. Yeah? So they are just the conditions that blow about in the world, the things that change around in the world. Yeah? Sometimes we get what we want, gain, sometimes we don't, loss. Sometimes people like what we do and we get praise, sometimes they don't approve and we get blame, and it just kind of blows around. You know? So they're often rendered as the worldly winds, because that kind of gets across the way they just blow about in the world. One day the wind blows one way, and the other day the wind is blowing in the opposite direction. Yeah? So these are the worldly winds. And the idea of the teaching is that, well, we quite naturally want the winds to blow one way. We quite naturally want gain and praise and fame and pleasure and so on. And when they blow the other way, we don't want that. We don't like that. We don't want loss and blame and infamy and pain and all the rest of it. Yeah? And of course it's fine to kind of try and set our life up as much as we can to experience the pleasurable worldly winds. But the point of the teaching is, well, they just blow about in the world, and we can't control them all the time. We can't possibly get them to blow the right way all the time, because they're just the changing conditions of the world. Yeah? So if we're too invested in them blowing one way and not the other, if we're too kind of caught up in wanting one set of conditions and not the other set of conditions, well, we're just creating disappointment for ourselves. We're just setting ourselves up for disappointment. Yeah? And the teaching of the worldly winds is kind of getting at how, we do tend to be blown about by them. We tend to be affected by the way the winds blow. Yeah? So when things are going the right way, as it were, when we're experiencing the worldly winds that we find pleasurable, we feel happy, we feel good, we feel life is as it should be. We feel maybe it kind of buoys up our confidence and our self-esteem and so on. But when they blow the other way, it can blow us the other way, and we can feel life's not fair, life's not treating us properly, we can lose confidence, we can lose initiative, and so on. Yeah? So the reason the Buddha taught this teaching of the worldly winds is to kind of get us to learn to recognise these situations and not to be so blown about, not to be so invested in trying to get the external conditions of life right all the time, as it were, not to be over-invested in that, but to be more equanimous and more free in that sense. So, the worldly winds is a really great teaching because it's very, very practical. It kind of shows us on a moment-by-moment, day-by-day basis how we can be blown about by change, how we can be blown about by the changing conditions of life. Yeah? So I'm just going to go through the worldly winds now, each pair of them, and kind of give some examples of how they might blow about in my life. Yeah? And they're very ordinary examples, but nevertheless they can still blow me about. I can still be affected by them, kind of blown around in that kind of way. So first of all, there's gain and loss. Gain and loss. So just, the way we sometimes get what we want, and sometimes we don't. Yeah? And we're all going to experience gain and loss as we go through our lives. It's absolutely inevitable, in a changing universe, that we'll experience gain and loss. Sometimes we might experience quite small examples of it, and there'll be times when we experience gain and loss in quite kind of big, significant ways too. But just to give a very small everyday example, the little story that came to mind and I was thinking of this, was when I used to live in a house, in a row of terraced houses. Yeah. So it was a row of quite small terraced houses. And on this street where I lived, parking was quite difficult. You know, there was a real parking spaces were at a premium, yeah, because there just wasn't very much space. And I often worked away from home, or I'd often get back home quite late. And I just noticed how, when I was about 2 minutes away from home, a little kind of thought process would start chuntering away in my mind. I'd start wondering, is there going to be a parking space? Is there going to be a parking space? And by the time I was turning into my street and driving up the road, this was really kind of chuntering away. I was kind of getting quite kind of concerned about whether there would be a space for me to park. Yeah? And I'd drive down the road just kind of looking, trying to kind of spot a space between all the cars, especially when I got to near where my house was. Yeah? And sometimes there was a space, and I almost felt elated. It's amazing, how happy a piece of tarmac can make a man at the end of the day. Yeah? And then sometimes, so that was gain, and then of course sometimes there wasn't a space, and that was loss. And then I'd have to drive around the back streets and find somewhere else to park and kind of trudge back. And that affected me as well. I'd have to be careful. I'd have to be careful that I didn't start thinking certain unskillful thoughts, particularly about my next door neighbours who owned 3 cars. So it was amazing, just a very little trivial thing, the winds of gains and loss, but I could just see myself affected by them, blown about them. Yeah. Then there's the worldly winds of praise and blame. Yeah. So this is just to do with whether other people like or dislike what we do. Yeah. And again, you can't please everyone all the time. As you go through life, inevitably you will experience praise and blame at different times. It's just part of life. Yeah. And there's a great little teaching, a great little story that illustrates this. It's the story of a Buddhist teacher who was leading a weekend retreat for people that are fairly new to Buddhism. And on this weekend retreat, she apparently decided that she'd make the practice of every time they went in the shrine room, she would just bow to the Buddha as a mark of gratitude and respect. So that was her practice during the weekend retreat. And when it got to the end, and people were saying thank you and all the rest of it, 2 people came up separately and gave her a little note of paper, a little something written on a card or a note of paper. So she just kind of put them in her pockets and read them later. So she took the first one out and opened it up, and it said, dear so-and-so, I'd like to thank you very much for the weekend retreat. I found it really great. And for me, the highlight, the thing that I found really moving and inspiring was watching you bow to the Buddha. That just really touched something in me, and I wanted to thank you for that. I just found that very inspiring. So that was great. I just felt, folded the note up and put it back in her pocket. Then she got the other note out of the other pocket and opened that up and read it. And it said, dear so-and-so, thank you for the retreat. However, I must say, I was really disappointed to see you bowing to the Buddha. I thought Buddhism was free of all that superstitious nonsense, and it spoilt the retreat for me. So she folded that one up and put that back in her pocket. Yeah? So that's what life is like. Yeah? Sometimes we get praise, sometimes we get blame. Sometimes we get praise and blame for exactly the same action. Yeah? You just can't please everyone all the time. It's just part of life. That's just how it is. Yeah. But what this teaching is getting at is, well, how are we affected by that? How are we blown about by the winds of praise and blame? So the next pair is fame and infamy, which in a way is quite similar to praise and blame, because it's to do with being liked or not liked. But I think in a way it's more to do with fame and infamy. It's more to do with whether we are noticed and popular and prominent in the kind of circles that we move in. Yeah? I think that that's what it's getting at. It's getting at that very innate instinctual desire to be popular, to be liked, to be noticed. Yeah? And actually I was reading a book on fame and the culture of fame and the culture of celebrity in our culture. And it used this phrase which I found really interesting. It talked about how we all want to be socially acceptable individualists. Yeah? So what we want is to be socially acceptable individualists. Which I thought really, it touched on something about the human condition. That's what human beings want. We want to stand out and we want to fit in at the same time. Do you see what I mean? We really want to stand out, but not too much. We also want to fit in. Yeah, we want to belong. That's I just think in a way, a very natural, strong instinct in us as human beings. And in this book, it was saying that the culture of celebrity and fame was a kind of intensification of that desire to stand out and fit in, which I thought was very interesting. Yeah. So, yeah, often we're motivated by that. And maybe to an extent that's fine, but perhaps sometimes we can be blown about by it in less helpful ways. An example of this from my life that came to mind was a few years ago I got asked to write a little article for the local newspaper. Yeah. And it was following on from something that someone else had written the week before, which I didn't quite agree with. So I wrote this mildly provocative piece, kind of criticising the thing from the week before. Yeah. And, I wrote it and I sent it by email and I did the thing of, how it is, you press the send button and that's it, it's gone. And it was really interesting watching my response over the next few days in the time from sending it off to when it was going to appear in the newspaper. So first of all, I felt quite pleased with myself and almost a bit elated, a bit intoxicated maybe. I thought, that's good, I hope it's going to cause a stir. I hope people are going to notice, that's good, I'm pleased I've done that. But then about 24 hours later, this kind of anxiety started to kind of creep in. I said, I hope I haven't gone too far. I hope I'm not going to upset anybody. And I just kind of swung to the other way. Yeah. So in other words, I was being blown around by the worldly winds of fame and infamy. That was what was kind of motivating me, rather than just a desire to kind of tell the truth as I saw it and understood it. Yeah. I was getting blown around by those worldly winds. Anyway, the newspaper article came out, and there was absolutely no response whatsoever. Complete and utter non-response. So there's fame and there's infamy and there's also anonymity. And that is even worse, I tell you. It was a very kind of revealing little incident in that way, just showing how those worldly winds can blow about. Yeah? And maybe we notice other ways we get blown around, just kind of small everyday ways. Maybe we laugh at a joke, we don't really think it's funny, but we want to kind of fit in. Or our attitude to people at work is slightly conditioned by how popular they are with other people or not, or just little things like that. Yeah, that's the worldly winds of fame and infamy blowing. And then lastly, there's the worldly winds of pleasure and pain. Yeah. So, sometimes life is pleasurable. Sometimes life is sweet. Sometimes we have fun. Sometimes life brings delight. Yeah. But at other times, life can be uncomfortable, even painful. Or, as we get older, we have more illness. We experience more discomfort, and so on. And again, this teaching is saying, well, that's just part of life. You can't control things all the time. You can't only experience pleasure. Inevitably, at times in your life, you're going to experience pain. Yeah? And but the question is, well, how do we respond when that happens? How do we respond when these worldly winds are blowing in different directions? And again, we can look at that at even quite small, everyday examples. When the boiler breaks down in winter and the central heating isn't working, how does that affect us? Yeah, okay, we're cold, but how does it affect us emotionally? Yeah, how do we feel when we kind of phone up and try and get the repairman to come? Yeah, what happens if there's no milk in the fridge? What happens if we've got to walk to work and it's raining? Just those little kind of instances. What's our emotional response to them? How might we be blown around or less blown around by the worldly winds of pleasure and pain? So that's what this teaching is getting at. So in other words, I think the worldly winds, this teaching, it's about the ethics of everyday life. Yes, so those examples I've given, they're very small, everyday examples. In a way, they're quite trivial examples. But I think they still blow us about. We still can get a little bit irritated. We can still get a little bit impatient. We can still get a little bit intoxicated by just these small ways the worldly winds change direction. Yeah? So this teaching is getting at the ethics of everyday life. It's just getting us to look at those very small little things that are happening day by day and notice our response and notice whether we could be more aware of them and respond more skillfully to them. Sometimes I almost think we respond better when the worldly winds are blowing more strongly. Sometimes when there's a real kind of gale going on in our life and things are very difficult, it almost draws out the best in us. It's like we're almost more aware, oh, this is the worldly winds, this is difficulty, this is change. I've just got to respond to this as best we can. Yeah? But it's often in those smaller, more trivial examples that we can get a bit petty and a bit small-minded, I think, because we think we ought to be able to control them, and we think these things oughtn't to happen. Yeah? So it's about the ethics of everyday life. It's about those small things which can kind of catch us out, which can trigger craving or ill will or irritation in us. Yeah? You could also say it's about the karma of everyday life. So in Buddhism there's this idea of karma, there's this idea that we're creating ourselves all the time through what we do and through what we think. Yeah? We're just becoming what we think all the time. Yeah? So if we think generous thoughts, we'll tend to be generous, and that just makes us more of a generous person. We create ourselves in that kind of way. Or if we think ungenerous thoughts, we'll tend to act in an ungenerous way, and that tends to kind of condition the kind of person we become. It becomes harder and harder to be generous, to be open-hearted, because of all the thoughts and actions that we've done. So this is the idea of karma. And again, a lot of karma is what you could call everyday karma. It's just the karma of those small, seemingly trivial incidents. In the Buddhist tradition, it was called habitual karma. Yeah? I'm just going to read a little quote from Sangharakshita, which describes habitual karma. So he says, "A very great part of one's life is probably made up of habitual karmas, things we do over and over again, often without realizing the effect they're having on us. The action may not amount to very much, it may not take up much time, but if we do it every day, perhaps several times a day, it has its effect, like drops of water wearing away a stone. All the time we're creating karma, either forging a sort of chain which binds us, or planting seeds of future growth." So yeah, the worldly winds is a teaching which gets into the ethics of everyday life, the minutiae of everyday life, and also shows us how our responses to these little incidents are creating our life, are creating who we are, the kind of person that we become. And the last point I want to make is that the worldly winds are also the winds of change. They're just how the conditions of our life change moment by moment. And so for me that makes it a great teaching, because it shows how ethics is connected to wisdom. Yeah? So from the Buddhist point of view, what makes an action ethical is not just some arbitrary thing, but what's ethical is what's acting in accordance with how things are, what's acting in harmony with reality, in harmony with how things are. Yeah? So there's a kind of connection, a relationship between ethics and wisdom. And I think that the teaching of the worldly winds really helps to show this again on that day-by-day basis. You just see that things change. Yeah? The conditions of life change. The wind blows one way, then it blows the other way. And we have a choice how we respond. We can either be blown about, we can either be irritated or anxious or put out or deflated, we can lose initiative, or we can just see it as change, we can just realise what's going on, we can be a bit more aware, and we can treat life with a bit more equanimity, with a bit more even-mindedness, as it were. Yeah? So this teaching really kind of makes that connection with ethics and wisdom, but in a way, being ethical, it's learning to work with change, it's learning to respond to the reality of change in a more skillful, more creative kind of way. Yeah? So we'll never be free of the worldly winds, in the sense that they always blow around in the world. We can't escape them. But we can be free in the sense of our own response to them. We can develop equanimity, we can develop an understanding of the worldly winds, and that means that internally we're just more free. We're more we're more free of emotional reactions to them. We can sail free